President Kennedy was admitted to Parkland Hospital for treatment for an attempt to save his life about 7 minutes after the shooting in Dealey Plaza. During that ride to the hospital, Secret Service agent Clint Hill, as we all know, was positioned above the President and the First Lady, trying to protect them. And he had 7 minutes to observe the nature of the wound to President Kennedy's head. He wrote in a written report 1 week after the event, and he also testified the following year that a large portion of the right rear of the President's head was missing, and part of that portion missing was lying in the back seat with hair on it, and that there was a brain matter attached to that piece of the skull, and that there was brain matter and bloody water all over the rear of the car, all over the car trunk. But his vivid descriptions of the wound support the presence of some type of exit wound in the right rear of the head. At no time in his written statement or in his testimony the following year did he ever mention damage to the top of the head or to the right side. The defect he saw was to the right rear. This same observation was made by the medical staff at Parkland Hospital. Well over 20 people got a good look at President Kennedy's head wound during the treatment. His treatment lasted for 40 minutes, from about 12:40 until about 1:20. Everyone at Parkland Hospital who wrote treatment notes the day of the assassination all described only one wound in President Kennedy's head that they could see. And that one wound that they could see was an avulsed, blown out wound in the right rear in this location that they interpreted as an exit wound. Now, these were people who saw bullet wounds every week of the year, sometimes every day at Parkland Hospital. They knew the difference between an entrance wound and an exit wound, and all they saw was a rather large blowout the size of a baseball or the size of a human fist behind President Kennedy's right ear. It's my conclusion that President Kennedy was shot in the head 3 times, once from behind, very low in the right rear of the skull, and twice from the front. One shot from the front almost certainly entered near the hairline in this location. That's probably the reason it was not seen at Parkland Hospital. President Kennedy had long bangs in front, he had long hair. People in Washington, D.C. saw photographs the week after the autopsy, which showed an entrance wound in this location, high above the right eye, almost exactly in the hairline. Those photographs never made it into the official record, but the 2 witnesses who recall seeing such photographs are credible witnesses, and therefore I conclude that this is the origin of a second shot was from the front and that it entered in about this location. I believe the exit for that shot was in the upper left part of the skull, and that it did not create a hole that was noticed by anyone at Parkland. A third shot that struck President Kennedy in the head would be the one that created this large tangential wound in the right rear of the skull. Dr. Kemp Clark in Dallas described the large wound as a tangential wound, as a bullet that went in and exited from generally the same area. And this is the right rear of the skull. The large wound that you see in the Audrey Bell wound diagram, the Charles Crenshaw diagram, and that's recalled by so many people who were present at Parkland Hospital. That wound was probably a tangential wound from somewhere near the right front of the limousine, maybe more to the side than from the front, maybe from the area of the grassy knoll fence. And that, I believe, is what caused the large blowout here. It was the third shot to the head, the tangential wound. And in fact, there was a bullet found attached to a piece of skull and hair and brain tissue in the grass in Dealey Plaza on the opposite side of the street, which could have been from this exit. If one studies the contemporaneous treatment notes from the day of the assassination, or for that matter, the testimony given under oath the following year by the Dallas doctors and nurses, the description is universally of a large defect in the right rear of the skull, which they all interpreted as a wound of exit. Apparently no one at Dallas saw this entry wound, and no one saw this exit wound up here because, after all, they did not perform an autopsy to Parkland and they did not shave the head. They recall the most visible damage. This red bone, this triangular red bone here in the rear of the skull, is the occipital bone. Everyone has an occipital bone. It's triangular, and it's in the squarely in the middle of the back of your head, and it is somewhat shaped like a triangle. Everyone has two parietal bones, a right parietal bone and a left parietal bone. In this case, I've painted the right parietal bone a gray color, and everyone has two temporal bones, a right and left temporal bone. So the right temporal bone on this skull is painted pink. Many of the Parkland wound descriptions are of an occipital wound. If the wound was only occipital, it would be in this area where we see the red color. Other members of the medical staff, like Dr. Crenshaw and Dr. Clark, have described a head wound on President Kennedy that was occipital parietal. An occipital parietal wound would be in this location. It's still the right rear of the skull, and it's still behind the right ear. I'm going to place my finger on the auditory canal. This is the location of the ear canal. So you can see that an occipital parietal wound is still behind the right ear, maybe slightly above the right ear. One person at Parkland Hospital, Dr. Jenkins, described the head wound as temporal occipital. Now, if the wound was temporal occipital, it would be in this location here, and that's still behind the right ear. So all of the wound descriptions of the head wound from Parkland Hospital are consistent. They're all of a large gaping wound devoid of scalp and devoid of skull, with exposed brain tissue behind the right ear. The one Dallas physician who gave perhaps the most eloquent description of President Kennedy's head wound was Dr. McClelland, when he testified before the Warren Commission in March of 1964. He stated that at one point during treatment, he looked into the wound, and in his estimation, at least 1/3 of the brain tissue was missing. He saw two types of exposed and damaged brain tissue, and one was cerebral tissue, which I've painted blue-gray in this model. He also saw severely damaged and exposed cerebellar tissue from the cerebellum, which I painted red in this model. Now, as President Kennedy was lying on the gurney for treatment in Parkland, his skull was in this position, and Dr. McClelland made it very clear that at various times during the treatment, during the external cardiac massage and during the treatment on President Kennedy, that portions of his brain left his cranium and fell out onto the cart. It's a rather graphic description, but it's important. Some of the brain tissue which fell out on the cart was from the cerebellum, from the right cerebellum of President Kennedy. A wound that's located in the top of a skull or in the right side of the skull is not going to expose tissue in the cerebellum. If you have cerebellar tissue, the red shown here in this model, falling out of a wound during treatment, that confirms that the wound is in the rear of the head, not in the top of the head and not in the right side of the head. 4 different physicians who helped to treat President Kennedy on November 22nd wrote in their treatment notes that they saw damaged cerebellum and that they saw it falling out on the cart. And none of the people who wrote treatment notes the day of the treatment or who testified before the Warren Commission in 1964 described the top of the head as missing or described a blowout on the right side. No one described such damage from Parkland Hospital. We see such apparent damage in the Zapruder film, but no one among the 20+ treating physicians and nurses described that type of damage on President Kennedy. When President Kennedy's body left Dallas, it had been wrapped in sheets and was placed in a very heavy bronze ceremonial viewing coffin or viewing casket, the kind you would see used at a public funeral. The casket, empty, weighed well over 400 pounds. He had one sheet wrapped around his head and another sheet wrapped around his nude body. The ambulance driver for the funeral home in Dallas, Aubrey Reich, observed President Kennedy's body placed in the heavy bronze casket. He observed his boss, Mr. Vernon O'Neill, close the lid, and he remained with that casket from the time it left Parkland Hospital until the time it went up the ramp, the entry ramp to Air Force One at Love Field. Aubrey Reich is a very important witness because he allows us to conclude with confidence that the body really did leave the hospital in the bronze casket, and it really did enter Air Force One in the bronze casket. When President Kennedy's body was delivered to Bethesda Naval Hospital, it was delivered in a cheap, weather-beaten aluminum shipping casket with ugly turnbuckles on it, with no fancy side rails, no bronze color, a cheap aluminum shipping casket. And when the shipping casket was first opened inside Bethesda, the president's body was in a zippered body bag. It was not wrapped in sheets. His head was wrapped in a sheet. The body was in a zippered body bag, and when the body bag was removed, the body was nude. So what this tells us is that there was a major interruption in the chain of custody, if you will, of the president's body. In any court case I can imagine, if there was a chain of custody interruption in the body before the autopsy was performed, most likely the autopsy report would not be admitted into evidence. It would be thrown out of evidence. When Air Force One landed at Andrews Air Force Base at 6:00 p.m. on November 22nd, and then rolled to a stop at 4 minutes later at 6:04, a hydraulic lift lowered the bronze casket from Dallas to the ground, and numerous people, some of them military honor guard, some of them civilian aides, helped load this bronze casket into a light gray Navy ambulance that had driven up next to the airplane. We know today that this light gray Navy ambulance was not a hearse. It was a cardiac ambulance. It was provided because of Lyndon Johnson's history of severe heart trouble. LBJ had had a severe heart attack in the mid-1950s. There was a rumor that he had had a heart attack in Dallas, so the cardiac ambulance was provided in case he needed treatment. Jackie Kennedy, at the last minute, decided, she said, "We'll go in that vehicle." And at that point, the plans of those who had been trying to arrange the autopsy fell apart. If one studies the Air Force One tapes that we have today, Air Force One audio tapes of the trip back from Dallas to Washington, you quickly become aware that there was a tug of war over where the autopsy was going to be performed and over how the body was going to be transported to the autopsy. The people on the airplane, Admiral Berkeley, who was President Kennedy's military physician, and General Clifton, the military aide, both were in favor of an autopsy at Walter Reed Hospital, which is an Army facility. They wanted the body to go to Walter Reed. They wanted the body to go by a mortuary-style ambulance, which is another way of saying hearse. The Secret Service in the White House Situation Room, Mr. Gerald Bain, the head of the White House detail, wanted a Bethesda autopsy and was in favor of helicopter transportation. This argument, this ongoing discussion, played out over the 2-hour and 35-minute flight, and ultimately the Secret Service won. Mr. Bain had persuaded those on board the aircraft to do it his way. And his way was to transport the body of President Kennedy to Bethesda Naval Hospital by helicopter from Andrews Air Force Base, and to transport everyone else, including the First Lady, to the south grounds of the White House. If one listens to the tapes, one understands that the plan, heartily endorsed by General Clifton, was to get the First Lady to leave the airplane in darkness. The television lights were on the left-hand side. The casket was lowered on the left-hand side. The plan was to get Jacqueline Kennedy secretly exiting a door, the forward right-hand side of the airplane, the forward starboard galley door in the darkness, and to fly her and everyone else in the presidential party to the White House in 3 helicopters. So the plan was to separate her from the body. She destroyed that plan by pointing at the light gray Navy ambulance and saying, "We'll go in that." Why is that important? It's important because President Kennedy's body arrived at Bethesda Naval Hospital not only in the wrong casket and in the wrong wrappings, it arrived in the wrong vehicle, and it arrived much earlier than the motorcade from Andrews Air Force Base. Let me repeat that. President Kennedy's body did not arrive at Bethesda Naval Hospital in the light gray Navy ambulance that contained the bronze casket from Dallas. His body arrived in a hearse, in a black Cadillac, from which a shipping casket was removed, and then later, as the shipping casket was opened, his body was inside a zippered body bag. The witnesses to this arrival are unimpeachable. Petty Officer Dennis David and one of his sailors who helped him with the working party that night, Donald Rebentish, were interviewed in the 1970s, and they talked eloquently about the black hearse that arrived at the morgue loading dock and how men in suits, government agents in suits, got out of the car. They were told to carry the casket into the morgue. They carried the shipping casket from the black hearse into the anteroom, the morgue anteroom. They set the shipping casket down in the anteroom, and they were told to leave, so the working party left. Later that night, after the autopsy, Dr. Boswell, Navy pathologist Dr. Boswell, confirmed to Dennis David that yes, the president was in the shipping casket that you and your working party offloaded from the hearse earlier tonight. So we know that was President Kennedy arriving in a black hearse and in a shipping casket, in the wrong car and in the wrong casket. Sergeant Boyjan was in charge of the security detail at Bethesda Naval Hospital the night of President Kennedy's autopsy. He had been sent, along with seven or eight other Marines, from the Marine Barracks in Washington, D.C., to Bethesda Naval Hospital with orders to report to Admiral Galloway and provide security for the autopsy. Now, this is physical security. These are Marines wearing dark green and light brown uniforms, Marines with guns. This is not an honor guard. This is not the Joint Service Casket Team. This is a security detail. They arrived early that night. They performed security for the autopsy, and 4 days afterwards, on November 26th, Sergeant Boyjan wrote his after-action report. His after-action report is solely about providing security for the president's autopsy. In that report, dated November 26th, he states, the casket arrived at 1835 hours, 6:35 p.m. The motorcade from Andrews Air Force Base did not arrive at Bethesda Naval Hospital until 6:55, 5 minutes before 7. That's right, the Andrews motorcade arrived 20 minutes after the black hearse with the shipping casket. That light gray Navy ambulance then sat out in front of the hospital for 12 minutes. We know about these times because they were all recorded by the newspaper reporters who were present, and they were published in articles the next day in the papers. What this means is that the American public and many people throughout the world witnessed a charade at Andrews Air Force Base. The American public witnessed a large bronze casket being lowered on a hydraulic lift, placed in a light gray Navy ambulance. Jackie Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and others got in that light gray ambulance and drove to Bethesda Naval Hospital. The American people believed that President Kennedy's body was in the bronze casket that they saw driven away in the light gray Navy ambulance, but it could not have been. We know from Dennis David and Donald Rebentish, we know from the Boyjan report, that a black hearse delivered President Kennedy's body in a shipping casket at 6:35 p.m., 20 minutes before the Andrews motorcade. The two big questions that arise from this are, how did the body get there? And number two, what was the purpose for all this? What was the purpose for getting the body to Bethesda as soon as possible by surreptitious means? Well, we know how it got there. If one studies the Air Force One tapes, one finds a passage in which Roy Kellerman, now Roy Kellerman was Secret Service. He's talking to his Secret Service boss in the White House Situation Room, Jerry Bain. Roy Kellerman identifies, at the end of this long discussion about where the autopsy will be, he identifies 2 helicopters for transportation of the body to Bethesda.
Air Force One, Andrews, Roger. Go ahead, your traffic now, sir.
Just a duplex. How's this?
Go ahead, Digest. It's duplex.
Again, I repeat. 3 helicopters transport people to the White House lawn, okay?
That is affirmative.
Roger. Okay, White House 102 and 405X transportation to Navy Hospital, okay?
That is affirmative.
That's a roger. I am keeping, I will join Hill and his party to Navy Hospital, okay?
Digest, this is Duplex. You accompany the body aboard the helicopter.
Roger.
His boss, Jerry Bain, then tells him, you accompany the body aboard the helicopter. I've recently studied the videotapes that one can obtain of the arrival at Andrews Air Force Base. And of course, the first thing you see is the bronze casket is put in a light gray Navy ambulance that's driven off. Then you see President Johnson disembark and make a short speech.
I will do my best. That is all I can do. I ask for your help and God's.
And then the lights are turned off. They are shut down. All the lights are turned off and the coverage ends immediately. It took, I think, about 6 minutes for LBJ's helicopter to get from Andrews Air Force Base to the White House. In contrast, there were 8 or 9 minutes available as soon as the lights were turned out for a helicopter to transport President Kennedy's body from Andrews to Bethesda Naval Hospital. We have a witness for a helicopter's landing at the Oak Club parking lot. Paul O'Connor, who was one of the Navy enlisted men at the autopsy, has told author William Law in his oral interview that there were helicopters landing out in front of the hospital. We know what those were. That was the Joint Service Casket Team from Andrews Air Force Base, the Honor Guard. And that there was also a helicopter that landed in the Officers Club parking lot behind the morgue in the darkness. That helicopter that landed in the Officers Club parking lot, I'm convinced, is the one that carried President Kennedy's body from Air Force One and met the black hearse, which was surely from Gawler's funeral home, and then transported it to the loading dock at the morgue 3 or 4 minutes later at 6:35. We know from the eyewitnesses, from Dennis David and Donald Robintish, and we know from the Boysen report that President Kennedy's body arrived at 6:35 p.m. in a shipping casket and a body bag, delivered by the wrong vehicle, by a hearse. The question is, why would anyone on Air Force One want to remove President Kennedy's body from the Dallas bronze casket after it was taken on board? And the answer to that question, I believe, lies back at Parkland Hospital. After President Kennedy was pronounced dead, after his body was washed, after he was wrapped in sheets and placed in the bronze casket at Parkland Hospital, the Secret Service tried to remove his body. They had the casket on a rolling gurney on a church truck, and they were taking it out to the ambulance to be taken to the airport to go back to Washington. The county coroner, Dr. Earl Rose, attempted to prevent that from happening. He told the Secret Service in no uncertain terms that it was his job under Texas law to perform an autopsy, and that he was going to do that. There's no doubt in my mind that if Dr. Rose had performed an autopsy, we would have had an honest one, and we would have known exactly how many shots struck President Kennedy and from whence they came. There would not be the doubt that we have today. The Secret Service adamantly refused to comply with his demands. This confrontation went on for 20 or 25 minutes. It went on for a considerable period of time. There were 1 or 2 local policemen who tried to side with Dr. Rose. There was a large contingent of Secret Service who refused to comply and who eventually showed their weapons. According to Dr. Crenshaw in his book, they showed their weapons. Some of the people pulled back their coats and showed their pistols. Another one pulled out a semi-automatic rifle. They showed their weapons and said, if you don't get out of the way, you'll be run over with the casket. So Dr. Rose lost the battle for custody of President Kennedy's body. The Secret Service executed a quick getaway to Love Field with the bronze casket. I conclude that the reason his body must have been removed from the bronze casket as soon as it was taken on board the airplane, I'm talking about immediately, before the swearing in of Lyndon Johnson. During the initial moments of confusion, as soon as it was taken on board, I'm convinced the body was removed from the casket simply to prevent the Texas authorities from having second thoughts and showing up the last minute at the airport and saying, no, we're going to do an autopsy in the state of Texas. I'm convinced that's why the body was removed. The Air Force One conversations on the Clifton tapes reveal that Roy Kellerman, the Secret Service agent on the airplane, he had set aside 2 different helicopters to transport the body to Bethesda. Now, on the surface, that doesn't make sense. Why would anyone need 2 helicopters to transport one body to a hospital? I think that selection is proof that the body had been removed from the Dallas casket. I think one of those 2 helicopters had to be for the public display, for the Dallas casket coming down on the hydraulic lift, which surely was going to be photographed by television cameras. Everyone knew that. And the second helicopter to go to Bethesda was surely needed for the surreptitious transportation of the president's body, which had been removed from the Dallas casket before takeoff. So this fear of an honest autopsy by the Secret Service, that's what they were afraid of. This is why they had to remove the body from Parkland at gunpoint. They could not allow an honest autopsy. There were agents that were dirty. There were agents that knew what had happened, knew they'd been driven into an ambush, that knew what was going on. And so the need for the second helicopter was to secretly in the dark, after the Dallas casket had taken off publicly in helicopter number 1, the need for the second helicopter was clearly going to be to move the body itself in the darkness once the TV lights were turned off. So what we ended up with was the body arriving too early, 20 minutes before the Andrews motorcade. We then have a Dallas casket which is empty, but which the FBI doesn't know is empty, taken into the morgue anteroom at 7:17 p.m. Both FBI agents who were present at the autopsy told the House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1978 that they and 2 Secret Service agents, just the 4 of them, with no help from anyone else, offloaded this heavy bronze casket by placing it on a conveyance with wheels. They moved it into the anteroom, and then the FBI agents were denied admittance to the morgue and were not allowed to go in for many, many minutes. They weren't happy about it, and they noted their displeasure in their written report, but they were not allowed to go in. We have a third casket entry that night, as incredible as it may seem. At 8:00 p.m., the Joint Service Casket Team, the Honor Guard, these were men from all the different armed services wearing dress uniforms, white gloves, no weapons, men from the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, and even from the Coast Guard. The Joint Service Casket Team takes the Dallas casket into the morgue at 8:00 at night. That's recorded in their written report. So we have 3 casket entries that night. If it wasn't such an important subject, it would lend itself to perhaps being a French farce in a film, in a poorly written film. But it really happened. Once the president's body arrived in the wrong vehicle and in the wrong casket, the Secret Service had a serious problem. They had a Joint Service Casket Team that had met the airplane at Andrews Air Force Base. They had seen the Dallas casket. It was their job to ceremonially escort, to be the pallbearers for that casket and take it into the morgue and then stand guard during the autopsy, ceremonial guard, and ceremonial guard throughout that weekend during the funeral activities. The FBI agents who had been kept out of the morgue during the manipulations on the body were finally allowed to re-enter at 8:00. And they wrote in their report that they saw the Dallas casket opened, they saw the president removed, placed on the examining table while the honor guard was present. But there were 40 minutes that happened between the time they delivered an empty Dallas casket, which they didn't know was empty, and the time they were allowed to see it opened at 8:00. It's important to understand that almost everyone in this case has something to hide, and almost everyone is not telling the full story. That's what happens when you're either part of a cover-up or you're sucked into one without knowing it and are trying to protect yourself later. FBI agents Seibert and O'Neill were sent by the FBI to the autopsy to maintain the chain of custody on the body and to obtain any bullets removed from the body at autopsy and to deliver them to the FBI lab. That was their sole function. In their report written November 26th, 1963, the day after the funeral, expressed some great concern about the tight security placed around the autopsy room as soon as they delivered the casket, and about how they expressed their concern to the Secret Service and discussed this tight security with the Secret Service. And then they finally, they say everything was resolved. Well, the clear implication here is that this is bureaucratic language for the fact that they were not admitted. They were not initially admitted into the morgue. They were not let in for a considerable amount of time. Remember, they delivered the casket. Those two agents, and Kellerman and Greer, the two Secret Service agents, delivered that empty Dallas casket at about 7:17 p.m. And I don't think the FBI agents saw the casket open until 8 o'clock when the honor guard was allowed to take it in. So for 40 minutes, they were not allowed in the morgue. Now, once this inference became publicly known in 1981 through David Lifton's book, Best Evidence, they spent the rest of their lives denying that they had been barred from the morgue. However, there's a document that exists today that conclusively proves, in my opinion, the fact that they were kept out of the morgue for some time. The three pathologists who performed President Kennedy's autopsy at Bethesda Naval Hospital were Dr. James J. Humes, Dr. J. Thornton Boswell. Both of them were in the Navy. And the third participant was Dr. Pierre Fink, who arrived late after the autopsy started. He was an Army pathologist. Dr. Boswell, who was assisting Dr. Humes, drew a sketch of the damage to President Kennedy's skull on the back of the autopsy body chart. And he drew in a very large area surrounded with a dotted line and wrote the notation 10 by 17 missing. Dr. Boswell explained to the House Select Committee on Assassinations and to the ARRB that the dotted line represented the area completely devoid of bone. The 10 by 17 means 10 by 17 centimeters, a very large area of missing bone in the top of the head. Jeremy Gunn and I, on the ARRB, wanted to know whether the damage Dr. Boswell observed included damage to the back of the head, to the right rear of the head. So we requested that Dr. Boswell make a three-dimensional rendition on a skull model of that damage that he observed. Because after all we had was a two-dimensional drawing of the top of the head. So Dr. Boswell took in his hand one of the skull models we provided, and with a marking pen denoted the area of missing bone in President Kennedy's cranium. Now, this was the sole purpose of this exercise. Where was the missing bone and where was the entrance wound that you described in the autopsy report? I made a copy on my own skull model of the markings Dr. Boswell made on the skull model that's in the archives today. This area here, which I'll slowly rotate, is the area of missing bone noted by Dr. Boswell. So I'm going to rotate the skull down. This is the area of missing bone in the top of the skull. The entire right side and part of the left side of the top of the skull, Dr. Boswell says the bone was missing. This is the revelation, is that he said the entire right rear of the skull was missing as well as a large portion of the temporal bone in the right side, right parietal and right temporal area. This is an astonishing exhibit when one considers the localized wound described at Parkland Hospital, which was about the size of a small orange or a baseball. 5 of the Parkland Hospital treating physicians were deposed by the review board in 1998, right before we shut down our operations. One of them, Dr. Jones, made a point of mentioning on his own, without being questioned, without being prompted. It's in the transcript, anyone can check. He said that no bones were seen protruding from the right side of the head. There were no bone flaps on the right side, and he said he certainly did not see any evidence during the treatment of President Kennedy. He didn't see any evidence of any bone missing from the top of the cranium at all. He volunteered that information. He thought it was important enough to volunteer that information because all of these Dallas physicians have seen the bootleg autopsy photos many times. They know what the photos depict. They know that's not what they saw. Dr. Jones went out of his way to specify for us under oath that he did not see any missing bone in this area or in this area at Parkland Hospital. So what does this mean? It's clear to me that Dr. Boswell's sketch was a con job. It was an historical con job. He was recording for the record the damage created to President Kennedy's cranium during the pre-autopsy postmortem surgery at Bethesda Naval Hospital. He's recording this and representing it dishonestly as damage caused by the assassin's bullet, quote unquote. So you'll notice that Dr. Boswell's entry wound on the skull is down low. And by the way, I'm convinced that when the three pathologists describe an entrance wound in the rear of the skull at this location, I believe them. They were with the body, two of them, well over 3 hours, one of them for 2.5 hours. And they had a chance to not only observe this entrance wound up close, but to palpate it with their fingers. So I believe them. I don't believe this bullet entered from the Texas School Book Depository. I believe it came from the Daltex building, from a low floor, the second floor of the Daltex building, directly behind the limousine. And I think that's why the orbit of the right eye was cracked. Noted at the orbit of the right eye was cracked, it was badly damaged, and the right eye was popped out a little bit and divergent. So I think that's consistent with a horizontal trajectory from a low window directly behind the car, not from a high trajectory coming from up here. So anyway, the new information that we got from Dr. Boswell when he made his diagram for the review board was that, yes, indeed, there was a massive amount of missing bone in the right rear of the skull. So what I think is represented on Dr. Boswell's skull in the National Archives, which looks just like this skull, what I think is represented is the original blowout seen by the Dallas physicians and the further expansion of the damage to President Kennedy's skull performed during pre-autopsy surgery to remove evidence of shots from the front. This is what was happening between 6:35 p.m. when the body first arrived at Bethesda and 8 o'clock p.m. when the official autopsy record began. President Kennedy's exit wound in the right rear of his skull was dramatically expanded with an informal craniotomy, let us say. Illicit clandestine surgery, obstruction of justice. There are many ways we could describe this, but evidence of all shots from the front was removed. Evidence of shots from the rear, of course, was retained. And this is why the autopsy photos and evidence today bear no resemblance whatsoever to the wound described at Parkland Hospital. The real mystery about the Kennedy assassination, as far as I'm concerned, regarding the medical evidence, is what happened between the time the body arrived at an impossibly early hour, 6:35 p.m. What happened between 6:35 p.m. and 8 o'clock p.m. when the autopsy of record began? We know the autopsy of record began at 8 o'clock when a large audience was admitted into the morgue. They sat in the gallery, at least 35 people, and when the Dallas casket was opened and people saw President Kennedy's body removed from the Dallas casket at 8 o'clock, placed on an examining table. What happened between 6:35 and 8 o'clock? This is the key to understanding all the conflicts in the evidence, in the medical evidence in this case. The people who killed President Kennedy had a plan ahead of time. They had a patsy selected. The patsy had a location. It was a man in a building behind a man in a car, well above and behind the man in the car. A lone assassin scenario. That's the official cover story. So the medical evidence had to be made as much as possible to comply with this cover story. And the trouble is, as soon as William Greer and Roy Kellerman left Dealey Plaza with the mortally wounded president in their vehicle, they knew that they had a problem, because they knew that there had been several shots from the front and that the president had been hit from the front as well as behind, and that they knew there was a problem. This is why they couldn't allow an honest autopsy in Texas. They were under instructions to get it back to Washington where we can take care of the problem, where we can fix it. After working for the review board for 3 years, after swimming in the sea of the medical evidence every day for 3 years, after working on my book for about a decade, this is what I've concluded. The president's body arrived at 6:35 p.m. We know that. There was a quick initial examination of what had really happened, and a small number of photographs were taken of the true damage. We know that because there were people who saw these photographs the week after the autopsy. They never made it into the official record, but there were people, specifically Dennis David, Petty Officer Dennis David at Bethesda, and photographer Joe O'Donnell of the U.S. Information Agency. They saw photographs that showed the true wounds. A large hole in the back of the head, an entry wound in the throat, and an entry wound way up above the right eye. They saw those photographs. An initial examination was conducted. A few photographs were taken. And then I'm sure, there's no doubt in my mind, that Doctors Humes and Boswell, the two Navy pathologists, were given orders to sanitize the crime scene. And the way you sanitize this crime scene is to remove all evidence of frontal shots from the body. It's that simple. They had a nasty job to perform. There's no doubt in my mind that somebody used a World War III cover story. We can't tell the American people that communists killed the president shooting from multiple locations, because if we do, there'll be World War III and 40 million people will die. Those are the words of Lyndon Johnson. So I'm sure Humes and Boswell were ordered to sanitize the crime scene, to sanitize the body and remove evidence of shots from the front. So I conclude that this illicit, clandestine post-mortem surgery began maybe about 10 minutes after the body was examined. Maybe about 10 minutes to 7, 5 minutes to 7. It was a quick, dirty, and hurried job. Lasted maybe 12, 15 minutes. You had an entrance wound here, which they didn't see at Parkland because of the president's hair, but which was seen later in some photographs. This was removed with a large incision. That incision can be seen in the right superior profile color photograph. That is a man-made incision in that photograph. I'm sure that bullet tracks in the brain were removed. Brain tissue was removed wholesale. The most obvious wound seen in Dallas, which was this large tangential wound or exit back here, was grossly expanded by Dr. Humes. Dr. Humes always stated that he never had to perform a craniotomy to get the brain out of President Kennedy's cranium. A craniotomy is a skull cap removal performed by people doing brain surgery on living people or by pathologists doing autopsies on dead people. Dr. Humes always insisted that he never had to perform a craniotomy, that the damage from the assassin's bullet was so great that he just basically had to cut a little scalp here and there with a small incision and remove the brain. Well, that's nonsense. I'll tell you why it's nonsense. 3 witnesses to President Kennedy's wounds right after he arrived at Bethesda saw the same head wound seen in Dallas. Young Tom Robinson was a 20-year-old mortician working for the Gawler Funeral Home. He's one of the 2 people who arrived in the black hearse at 6:35 p.m. His wound diagram, made for the review board in 1996, shows a large wound in the back of the head, almost identical to what Nurse Bell drew and to what Dr. Crenshaw drew. He also drew dotted lines on the back of the skull, above and below the wound he recalled, the bullet wound. We asked him, what are the dotted lines in your diagram? He said, oh, that's where the doctors had to saw the skull open to get the brain out. Now, in a normal case, there would not be anything unusual about that statement. But in a case where the chief pathologist says, I never had to perform a craniotomy, that's a very important statement. There's another witness to postmortem surgery to expand President Kennedy's head wound. That's Ed Reed. Ed Reed was one of the 2 X-ray technologists, one of the young Navy enlisted men. He told the review board under oath in 1997 that he witnessed Dr. Humes during the autopsy, what he called the autopsy. He witnessed Dr. Humes make a large incision with a scalpel just behind President Kennedy's hairline. So it's in the frontal bone, but it's in the forward part of the skull. And he then witnessed Dr. Humes take out a circular bone saw and start cutting into the bone in this area. He and his partner, Gerald Custer, were then immediately dismissed, according to her. We were dismissed from the morgue, told to leave immediately. Go upstairs. 15 or 20 minutes later, they were recalled, told to come back down to the morgue, and then they took the skull x-rays after returning, after witnessing post-mortem surgery on the president's skull. So we not only have two witnesses to this surgery, Tom Robinson and Ed Reed, but we have two other witnesses to the same kind of head wound seen at Dallas after the body arrived at Bethesda. Two key physicians, Rear Admiral George Berkeley, the president's military physician, and Captain Robert Canada, the Navy commanding officer of the treatment hospital at Bethesda, both gave interviews to researchers in which they said, yes, they saw what was clearly an avulsed exit wound in the right rear of President Kennedy's head right after his body arrived at Bethesda Naval Hospital. Berkeley told this to two different JFK researchers during the 1980s. It was as if he wanted to unburden himself, but then got scared afterwards. So each time he told them this story and then says, I can't talk about it anymore. But to two different researchers of his own volition, Berkeley said, I saw a localized exit wound in the right rear of President Kennedy's head after the body arrived at Bethesda. Captain Canada gave an interview to Michael Kurtz in 1968 and told him in exquisite detail that, yes, I saw an exit wound in the right rear of the skull. It was an avulsed wound. It exploded outward from the inside. He described its dimensions. And then the interviewer, Mr. Kurtz, said, of course, you know, this conflicts with the autopsy report. And Captain Canada said to Kurtz, well, of course, that was part of the cover-up. Captain Canada then asked that Michael Kurtz not reveal that information until 25 years after his death. Fortunately, Michael Kurtz wrote about this in 2006 in his book, and we now know that one of the key administrators at Bethesda, one of the people in charge, Captain Canada, did in fact corroborate in 1968 that President Kennedy had an exit wound in the right rear of his head. The most controversial autopsy photos, the most problematic ones, are the pictures of the back of President Kennedy's head, because they don't show the wound seen by everyone in Dallas. They don't show the wound seen by Tom Robinson. They don't show the wound seen by Rear Admiral Berkeley and Captain Canada. We showed those photographs to the two FBI agents who were at the autopsy. They both looked at the photographs of the back of President Kennedy's head, and they both shook their head and said, no, I didn't see anything that looked like that. One of them, Agent Seibert, said, it looks like it could have been reconstructed or something. The other agent, Agent O'Neill, said, it looks like this has been doctored. He said, I don't mean the photo. He said, I mean the head. It looks like it's been doctored. But they both disavowed those photographs and impugned them, in my view, forever. I speculated in my book that it might just be rearranged scalp, that after the autopsy was over, that the pathologist might have just rearranged scalp from elsewhere on the head, from perhaps the upper left portion, and moved it around in front just to cover the true exit wound for 5 minutes for the taking of deceptive photographs. A colleague of mine, Dr. David Mantic, is firmly convinced that these are photographic alterations, and he may well be right. Dr. Mantic has viewed the autopsy photographs of the back of the head stereoscopically in the National Archives. He set up his own stereoscopic viewing device. And he said the only autopsy pictures that have any problems when viewed stereoscopically are the pictures of the back of the head. And he said in those pictures, the center of the image, where you see the wet, combed hair, appears to be two-dimensional. And the rest of the image appears to be three-dimensional. So this strongly implies to him photographic alteration, and that may indeed be the case. We just don't definitively know yet how these photographs were made, but we know they're dishonest, and we know they don't reflect reality. So what happened between 6:35 p.m. and 8 o'clock p.m. at Bethesda Naval Hospital? The body was cursorily examined for about 10 minutes. Some photographs were taken but never made it into the official record. There was then clandestine, illicit, post-mortem surgery simply to expand the president's head wound, massively expand it to 5 times its original size, and remove all evidence of frontal shots. It's that simple, okay? There was no fancy reconstructive surgery before the autopsy. It was just plain and simple butchery. It was like opening up a tin of corned beef. I'm sorry, it's a horrific way to describe it, but these people were in a hurry. They knew they had to perform a charade called an official autopsy before an audience, and so they hurriedly removed evidence of frontal shots. I'm convinced of that. Immediately after this post-mortem surgery was completed, this sanitizing of the crime scene, the two X-ray technicians, Ed Reed and Gerald Custer, were recalled to the morgue. They were gone about 15 or 20 minutes. They weren't gone that long, so I conclude they were called back immediately after it was over. They then took a series of skull X-rays. Custer remembers taking 5 or 6. There are only 3 in the record today. And therefore we know the skull X-rays in the record today do not reflect the damage seen at Parkland Hospital or the damage done by assassin's bullets. They reflect the damage done by post-mortem surgery. And in fact, the right and left lateral X-rays taken from the side do not show a blowout in the right rear of the head. What they do show is a bright white patch, which according to Dr. David Mantik in his analysis, emits about 500 times more light than it should in a normal X-ray. This not only suggests alteration, it proves it. His conclusion is that all 3 surviving skull X-rays are altered copy films. They're all altered films. And that at least 2, probably 3 others are missing. And you know, he and I conclude that the missing X-rays are those that couldn't be altered successfully. We think some were taken from an oblique angle, so they would have showed indisputably this cavity in the right rear of the head, and they probably couldn't be fixed. But the ones taken from the right and left side were fixed by light blasting. It's that simple. There was a quick photo set up after the X-rays were concluded. Someone was clever enough, psychologically I think, clever enough to lay down a fresh towel, make it look like the body had just arrived. They decided to use a head brace, the metal head brace, for most of the autopsy pictures for reasons of convenience for them, because the metal head brace obscures the condition of the rear of the head. You can't see the rear of the head in most of the autopsy photos. Most of the photos only show the top of the head or the right side. All those autopsy photos that show the metal head stirrup or metal head brace were taken immediately after the clandestine surgery and before the official autopsy began. I know that because none of the witnesses from the official autopsy that began at 8 o'clock, none of those witnesses recall seeing that head brace used. And none of them recall seeing the towel. The young mortician Tom Robinson, who was 20 years old in 1963, was interviewed extensively by the review board staff in June of 1996. We showed him the bootleg autopsy photographs and asked him if this is what he recalled seeing at the autopsy. He looked at the back of the head photo and said, "Yes, this is what I saw, except that there's no hole in this photograph." That was an interesting comment. And then, more tellingly, he looked at the autopsy photograph showing the damage to the top of President Kennedy's head. It's not a pleasant image to look at, but it's an important image to understand. Tom Robinson looked at that photograph and frowned and became visibly agitated. And he said to us, and I'm quoting to the best of my ability, he said to us, quote, "Well, that makes it look like that's what the bullet did." He said, "That's not what the bullet did, that's what the doctors did," unquote. So for Tom Robinson, a man who arrived at 6:35 p.m. in the black hearse with the shipping casket, who was present during the entire pre-autopsy surgery, for him to say, "That's not what the bullet did, that's what the doctors did," is significant to me. It's extremely important and confirms my hypothesis that most of these autopsy photographs were taken before 8 o'clock, before the official autopsy began. So the sequence that I see evolving inside the Bethesda morgue between 6:35 p.m. and 8 o'clock when the autopsy begins is first an initial inspection, initial photographs, which never made it into the record, then clandestine post-mortem surgery to remove evidence of shots from the front. Then the head series of the X-rays were taken. Then a quick series of photographs was taken. And then I think in the final 30 minutes between 7:30 and 8 o'clock, that's when President Kennedy's body had to be reintroduced into the bronze Dallas casket. Now, the bronze Dallas casket wasn't set outside in the anteroom until 7:17 p.m. We know that from an FBI record. So it was available after 7:17 to have the body reintroduced. And then, of course, the casket had to be somehow placed in a light gray Navy ambulance. There were two that night, by the way. There were two of those in the motorcade. Had to be placed in a light gray Navy ambulance and allowed to be found by the Joint Service Casket Team. So between 7:30 and 8 o'clock, we have President Kennedy's body reintroduced into the Dallas casket. It's found out in front of the hospital in a light gray Navy ambulance, and then the Joint Service Casket Team, the Honor Guard, does its ceremonial function and takes it into the morgue at 8 o'clock, and the autopsy begins. The official autopsy begins on a crime scene that's already been sanitized. There's one final indicator of an exit wound in the back of President Kennedy's head that can't be denied by anyone, and that's the Harper fragment. On November 23rd, the Saturday after the assassination, a young pre-med student, Billy Harper, found a piece of bone in the grass in the middle of Dealey Plaza. So this would be north of Elm Street. And he took it to his uncle, Jack Harper, who is a pathologist, as it turned out, at a local hospital. His uncle, the pathologist, shared this with two other pathologists, Dr. Noteboom and Dr. Cairns. Dr. Cairns was the head of pathology at the hospital. They all agreed that it was human bone, that it was fresh, it had fresh signs of blood on it, and that it was occipital bone from the back of the head. This is a significant piece of evidence which the House Committee on Assassinations decided to deal with by redescribing where it came from. The House Committee on Assassinations bet the farm on the accuracy of the autopsy photos and the x-rays. And that's where they went astray and came up with totally invalid conclusions. We know that the photos of the back of the head can't be true. We know that other photos were taken immediately after cranial surgery. We know that the lateral x-rays have been altered. So the way the House Select Committee reasoned was that since the back of the head was intact in the autopsy photographs, that the Harper fragment could therefore not be occipital bone. But did they hold this bone in their hand and examine it? No, it's missing. The person who signed for it was Rear Admiral George Berkeley, the president's military physician, who was also involved with the developing of all the autopsy photographs. So I believe he's in the cover-up right up to here, right up to his nostrils. So Dr. Berkeley was the last one to hold the Harper fragment. He signed for it and it's disappeared. But fortunately, the doctors at the hospital, the pathologist, photographed it next to a ruler, so we know its size. They photographed it from the exterior, from its exterior surface, and they photographed its interior surface. And Dr. Cairns reiterated to the House Select Committee in the 70s that this was clearly occipital bone. The Harper fragment alone is evidence that President Kennedy had a blowout in the back of his skull, and that the most troubling photograph in the entire collection of the back of the head intact cannot be true. There were 4 additional proofs that there was indeed clandestine cranial surgery on President Kennedy before the autopsy began. The first of these proofs is the fact that Tom Robinson witnessed many minute fragments of metal removed from the president's cranium and placed in a test tube or a vial during the postmortem procedures. This is problematic because there were only 2 fragments of metal officially removed from President Kennedy's cranium during the autopsy of record. And they were given to the 2 FBI agents, Seibert and O'Neill, and they took those fragments to the lab. But Tom Robinson recalled about 10 fragments. So those are not in the record. It gets worse. Petty Officer Dennis David, who was in charge of the working party who brought in the shipping casket to the morgue anteroom earlier that evening, Petty Officer David was asked to draw up a receipt for bullet fragments by a federal agent. The receipt he drew up was for 4 relatively large metal fragments. His estimate is that the total mass was larger than 1 bullet and less than 2 complete bullets. His receipt is not in the official record today, and none of those 4 bullet fragments is in the official record today. A third proof of postmortem surgery is the FBI Belmont memo. Alan Belmont was the number 3 man in the FBI in 1963. Assistant Director Belmont worked directly under Clyde Tolson, and Clyde Tolson worked directly under J. Edgar Hoover. Belmont was in charge of all FBI investigations, and in fact, he was in charge of the Kennedy assassination investigation. Assistant Director Belmont wrote a memo the night of the assassination on November 22nd, 1963. He wrote the memo during the autopsy while it was in progress. And in this memo, he states that the Secret Service has one bullet, which they're bringing from Dallas. That's the so-called stretcher bullet. There is also a bullet lodged behind the president's ear, and we are arranging to get that. So this statement by him at a very early time before the autopsy was concluded, that there's a bullet lodged behind the president's ear, is of extreme importance. It indicates that he had a back channel to someone inside the morgue, someone who knew what was going on and who witnessed the pre-autopsy shenanigans, the pre-autopsy clandestine surgery. This could have been Admiral Kenny, the Surgeon General of the Navy. It could have been Captain Stover, the head of the medical school. It could have been one of the federal agents present. There were federal agents present during the autopsy. Some were Secret Service and some may have been CIA. There were people throughout the autopsy who were whispering in corners, making suggestions to the autopsy pathologist, directing them to stop certain procedures and move on to others. That is not the behavior of Secret Service agents. Those guys are just bodyguards. Those are behaviors associated with someone who is trying to control the autopsy. So there were unknown people present who were directing the pathologist what to do and what not to do. And this information that Belmont received may have come from some of them, if not from an admiral or a general who was present. There's a fourth important indicator of postmortem surgery prior to the autopsy, and that is this bright red incision above the president's eye, which is seen in the right superior profile on the color autopsy photo. Dr. Peters was one of the treatment staff at Parkland Hospital who helped try to save President Kennedy's life. He stated in a documentary in 1988 that this was clearly a man-made incision and that he did not see any such incision at Parkland Hospital. And of course, I believe him when he says he didn't see it at Parkland, because no one wrote about such a large incision in their treatment notes, and no one discussed such an incision in their testimony before the Warren Commission in 1964. So his confirmation that this is a man-made incision in that photograph confirms that it occurred after the body left Parkland. We have two witnesses who vividly have recalled seeing photographs of a small entry wound in that same area, a very small entry wound, maybe 1/4 of an inch in diameter. That's Dennis David and Joe O'Donnell. The red incision is in exactly the same location. So I conclude from these facts that the red incision is evidence of the removal of evidence of one shot from the front. And the evidence is there. It won't go away. It's in a photograph that's in the official record, and it can't be denied. In any case where someone is killed by a gunshot to the brain, there's always a separate autopsy on the brain itself after the autopsy on the body. There's clear evidence in the record that there were 2 separate brain exams following President Kennedy's autopsy. This just doesn't happen unless someone's engaged in a cover-up. We knew there was a brain examination following President Kennedy's autopsy because there was a supplemental autopsy report published, which is largely about the brain examination. There was no typewritten date on the supplemental autopsy report about the brain exam. There's no typewritten date. There's a handwritten date of 12/6/63, but it seems that that's just the date that he passed it to higher authority. The people that support the very early brain exam, and were very clear about it, were Dr. Boswell, the number 2 pathologist, John Stringer, the official photographer, and a gentleman at Bethesda who processed brain tissue that day on Monday, which was a holiday for everyone else in America, but not if you were working on the president's autopsy. So those 3 people recalled that this occurred on Monday with no doubts whatsoever, and they said it to the House committee and they repeated it to the review board. Dr. Humes was always quite evasive on when the brain exam was conducted. The first brain exam, by the way, was the authentic brain of President Kennedy. It was President Kennedy's brain. You would think Dr. Fink would have been invited, but he wasn't. He recorded it in his notes, and in a later report he wrote for the Army, that he was called by Dr. Humes on November 29th, not the 25th. The 25th is Monday. That's when President Kennedy's brain was examined, Monday morning. He was called by Dr. Humes on the 29th of November and told there would be an examination of the brain and that he would participate in it. He doesn't say when it was conducted. He doesn't say whether it was conducted on that day, the 29th, or subsequently. But there's another source that indicates there really was a second exam, and that's Navy Chief Boyers, who wrote about processing brain tissue from the president on December the 2nd. So we know from Dr. Fink's written report to the Army and from Chief Boyer's interview with the House Committee on Assassinations that there was a second brain exam that took place between November 29th and December 2nd. This was clearly a substitute brain, a fraudulent specimen. It clearly was the source for the photographs that are now in the National Archives. The photographs of a brain in the National Archives cannot be photographs of President Kennedy's brain. I'll tell you why. FBI agent Frank O'Neill looked at those photographs in the archives and said, no, he shook his head, he said, no, this can't be President Kennedy's brain because I saw President Kennedy's brain after it was removed and it was over half missing. Over half of the tissue was missing. O'Neill also told us that all of this material in President Kennedy's brain was gone in this area. There was some missing in other areas, but this was all gone. And in the brain photographs in the archives, the right cerebellum is completely intact, and the cerebral cortex in this area is disrupted, but it's still present. Tom Robinson, the mortician from Gawler's Funeral Home, also told the review board that all of this mass was missing from President Kennedy's brain. So the photographs in the archives don't match the recollections of Tom Robinson or Frank O'Neill, or for that matter, of the Dallas treating physicians who all described massive damage to the brain in this area. It gets worse. The official photographer, John Stringer, recalled that the brain that was examined at the brain exam on Monday the 25th was serially sectioned. In other words, the bread loaf type incisions were made one by one, and the preserved brain was sliced into different segments, and each section that was sliced off the brain was placed on a light table and was lit from below and from above by a flash unit, and that he photographed each section one after the other on the light box. And of course, there are no photographs of sections with the brain photographs in the archives. Furthermore, John Stringer said that he only photographed the brain from above. He photographed the intact brain before the sectioning only from above. The brain photographs in the archives show images of an intact brain from above and from below. 50% of them are from above, 50% are from below. So on that basis, he said, I couldn't have taken those. And most damning of all, before we showed John Stringer, the official photographer, the brain photos in the archives, we asked him to recall independently, what type of film did you use? So he recalled that for the color versions, he used E3 Ektachrome color transparency film. He recalled that for the black and white negatives, he used, I think it was Panchromatic X in duplex holders. This was large format film, 4 by 5 inches. We then showed him the film in the archives of a brain, and the color transparencies are not made on Ektachrome film. They're made on some unspecified film without a brand name. And he checked the notches. There are notches in the corner of each piece of film that you can feel in the darkroom so that the photographer doesn't have to turn on the lights and ruin the film. And he said the notches in the film in the archives is not the same as the notches that were always present on Ektachrome E3 film. So he recalled using Kodak Pan-X black and white film in duplex holders. And what's in the archives is Ansco Company film from a film pack, which is numbered. So this really is the heart of the cover-up as far as I'm concerned. The fact that you would examine a substitute brain that did not belong to President Kennedy so that you could create photographs of a brain with a different pattern of damage in it presumably a pattern consistent with being shot from above and behind. Shows how desperate these people were to change history and to alter the facts of the case. John Stringer, the photographer, talked to me off the record after his deposition was over. This is back in 1996. And you always remember the one question that you forgot to ask during the deposition later after it's over. So I asked him in the lobby of the National Archives, I said, was Dr. Fink present at the brain exam that you attended? You said you attended with Humes and Boswell and yourself. I said, was Dr. Fink there? Was Dr. Fink present? And he said, no, and he got a little smile on his face, and he says, no, he says, I don't think they wanted him there. He caused too much trouble at the autopsy. Dr. Fink was the odd man out in a Navy setting. He was an Army pathologist in a Navy setting. Navy admirals present, Navy pathologist. He was invited late. He showed up late after the brain had been removed, after the lungs and heart had been removed. And he spent his entire time in the morgue demanding to know where were the entrance wounds and where were the exit wounds. That was his entire focus. That was the proper focus for a forensic pathologist, which is what he was. Doctors Humes and Boswell were not forensic pathologists. So Doctors Humes and Boswell were present at both brain exams. They knew what was going on. They were the perpetrators of the charade, of the fraud. Dr. Fink was present only at the second one. And it was clear to us that when we took his deposition, he did not know there had been a prior brain exam. He knew nothing about it. And we asked him if it was possible that his exam had been 1 or 2 or 3 days after the autopsy, and he said, "Oh no, that's too soon." He said it was a week afterwards. Many of the autopsy photographs are missing, based on everyone's testimony over the years, as possibly as many as 18 different views are missing from the autopsy photo collection. We know that at least 2 skull x-rays are missing. We know that the surviving skull x-rays are altered copy films because of the work of Dr. Mantic. We know that the Harper fragment is missing, and we know that the brain photographs in the National Archives cannot be of President Kennedy's brain. So we have a major U.S. government-directed medical cover-up in this case. It doesn't give me any pleasure to say that. I was in the Navy for 10 years on active duty. I worked for the Navy 10 more years in the civil service. I love the Navy and I love my country, but I hate lies even more. I can't stand lies. And particularly about important events like how is someone assassinated? How do we go to war? Those are the 2 big questions. This is what still motivates me. This is what drives me to talk about the case, is I don't like being lied to, particularly in the country that prides itself as being the greatest democracy on earth. We're not the greatest democracy on earth when we lie to our own people and when the mainstream media refuses to cover a subject, except to reinforce the government's views. The reason there was a JFK Records Act and the reason it created a review board was because the Congress didn't have the stomach for another investigation. The Warren Commission did an investigation which initially quieted people down and soothed our worst fears and got people to accept that, well, maybe a lone nut killed the president and at least we don't have to worry about that the Russians did it or that Castro did it. At least we won't go to war. Robert Blakey, the staff director for the House Select Committee on Assassinations, sealed all the really dicey evidence for 50 years. He didn't get away with it. Because of Oliver Stone's movie and the uproar caused by the film JFK, the American people demanded to know what are all these records that are still being withheld. As a result, the JFK Records Act was passed, and in 1993, the sealed records of the HSCA staff that would not have been seen for many more years were opened. And I was one of the first people to get to look at them, and they're all in the National Archives today. And we know now that there were 8 people they interviewed who disagreed with the autopsy photograph showing the back of the head intact. Disagreed. And yet the House Committee published a lie in Volume 7. In the medical volume, they published the big lie, which said that all of the people we interviewed agreed with the location of the wounds depicted in the autopsy photographs. The House Committee knew that wasn't true, and they sealed the evidence for 50 years. They also deposed Robert Knudsen, a Navy chief who was involved with developing autopsy photos the weekend after the assassination. His deposition was disturbing to them because he contradicted everything they thought they knew about the autopsy photos, about when they were developed, about how many there were. They buried his deposition for 50 years and never admitted that they took his deposition. They never even wrote about it in their 12 volumes. They took the deposition of Dr. Ebersol, the radiologist at the autopsy, and they wouldn't publish it in their report. They sealed it for 50 years, but now we have it. So no, I don't think there'll be another investigation. I'm sorry. I think the subject is radioactive to the U.S. government. So I'm sorry to say the American people are going to have to keep reading books and studying things on their own. But now they can do it. Now there's a JFK records collection, which I proudly contributed to. There are over 6 million pages in the National Archives that people can go and study themselves or can order through the mail. And so people should study the evidence themselves and make up their own minds. That was the goal behind the JFK Records Act and the Review Board. And at least we can do that. At least a lot of records have seen the light of day. But in the case of the medical evidence, it's a pretty sad story. Story of a massive cover-up and of official lying.